Frank. Welcome to the lockdown sessions. Welcome back to the lockdown sessions.
Thank you very much, Brad. A pleasure, as always, to speak with you. Earlier, I just told you I was looking at the CTG page on YouTube with all the lockdown sessions to figure out if you would ask me, Frank, do you have a subject that you want to share? I thought, by process of elimination, I go through the list and I think like, man, this man has talked about everything.
You know what? We're actually, it's funny you say that, because it's like a really nice bridge to the fact that we're on the last 10 episodes now, Frank. So I set a target to stop the lockdown sessions when lockdown in the UK finishes. So we've got about 10 weeks left, so there are about 10 more guests to come, and I've decided that for the 101st episode, the 101st episode, which will be the last one, I want to invite my parents to be the guests.
That's a lovely idea.
Because I've spoken to loads of different people, lots of different age ranges, but I've not spoken to people in their 70s or 80s and heard about their lockdown. So my dad said to me the other day that he would only come on as a guest if every guest in the lead up to that last one believes that he and my mum should be the guest. So I just asked someone this morning on a recording. So I'm going to ask you, like, as a first question, before we get going, do you think that my mum and dad should be the final guests on the lockdown sessions?
It's more than a clear yes, because, now that you mentioned it, I am very, very curious what your parents have to say. Honestly, I'm not kidding you at all. I think this is going to be a great ending. Very unexpected, also.
We're gonna set them up. That will be great. Yeah. So look, Frank, when we've done Real Talk over the last year, and over the last few months, we've been quite focused on our topics. Yeah, we've talked about, I think, some real hot topics for leaders, actually not just leaders, for all people, whether we started off, just talking about being more assertive, or more recently on inclusive leadership. But I wondered whether, as we come out of lockdowns around the world, maybe we could do the same, not have a topic, and just kick off with, what have you been up to over the last few months, right? How's 2021 for you, Frank? You're running a training business, a coaching business. We work a lot together. So come on, what's been going on in 2021? Because within that, there's going to be stories which I'm going to laugh at and you're going to laugh at, and we'll see where it goes.
I'll tell you something. That's actually a good question to lead with. Do you remember? I'm not sure if I said it in any of our shows or if that was us talking privately, but I remember when I said, maybe on New Year's Day or something like that, where I said, Brad, 21 is going to be just awesome.
Yeah, you did say that.
Yes, and so far it absolutely is. I love 21. Everything is shaping up the way I wanted it to be, and I mean, so far there have been surprises, but have only mostly been nice surprises. I think I feel very much in peace with myself. The things that I'm doing are inspiring to me also, so I get inspiration from things that I'm doing. So I think it's shaping up really well. And in the past couple of weeks, I've been, among other things, also been busy to learn a little bit more about how to incorporate some, let's call it like some neural or mind programming into some of the coaching practice that we do. I don't think there's something groundbreaking that never has been talked before, but I've been reading a book and participating in a course around positive intelligence, which is the name of a book, but what it actually is, it's about mental fitness. And mental fitness, to be honest, I think as I started to dive into it, I figured out that a good mental fitness, a great degree of self-command on how you are going to react on events that happen to you, bad or good or neutral, having the self-command of deciding what kind of action do you want to take?
Right.
What feels right? What else can you do? Can you, innovate on the situation? Allows us to pretty much accept any outcome and still be happy with it. And that sounds weird and a little bit esoteric, but the interesting thing is, bringing it back to mental fitness, is that, and we talked about this also just with other words, sometimes something that happens to you is you can decide how you're going to feel about this, right? And we are usually, most of us, I would even say every one of us, has trained ourselves to react in certain ways over the course of our life. And from a neuroscience perspective, we've built highways in our brain.
Right.
Neural pathways that are stronger than other pathways. And if we don't stop and decide, we automatically go on the highway with the 8 lanes. But these are, pre-programmed through, maybe our previous experiences and so on. So we don't really stop to think. And that was actually one thing I want to make a little loop here. So when you mentioned inclusive leadership earlier, as an example, when you and I, we've been talking a lot about helping people understand what does it mean, inclusive leadership, what kind of traits are included, and so on. They require a little bit of work. But then at the same time, when the pressure is on, people forget about these things, right? And with this ability to stop when something happens, let's say the pressure is coming, Brad, you need to give me the report in 2 hours, and you have no idea how to do it at that time. That gives you stress, it makes you feel bad, and anyway, you go into action, maybe depending on how you're wired, and you're hyperactive, but all the time anxious about what if I can't make it, and so on. So you don't stop to think, and use some of your other mental powers on exploring, what else can be done to satisfy that demand? Who can help me? What if I use something that already exists and just build on it and trying to build from scratch? Is a completely different way. But most people then, as we said, when the stress comes on, they ought to go on their neural highway of reacting in the way they usually react to. That may be very different between you and me. So I may feel as a victim of circumstance. I'm just saying, I just have this, I don't know, why did I have this shitty job? Why do I have this manager that's micromanaging me? Poor me, blah, blah, blah. I feel bad all the time. But you might react completely differently. You might be triggering a need to achieve. But you do this not because you're exploring the opportunities, you're having fun doing it. You do this for a short-term high, all the time feeling anxious about asking yourself, what if I don't make it? And so that's the big difference. I've been, learning a lot about this in the past couple of months, and I think it's super, super powerful in many, many ways.
You mentioned the phrase positive intelligence. Is this kind of the positive psychology theory they're going to put behind, like emotional intelligence was EQ, positive intelligence? Is this a new way of thinking for people?
Yeah, I think it's a simplified, first of all, it's not identical. And the way I would look at it is that it's a model that's easy to understand, versus, emotional intelligence is made of what, 20-something components. Very hard to remember. I mean, you can give a seminar about it, but the managers and leaders and whoever is listening, they go, aha, but do they remember any of that the next day? Maybe a little, but it's just too much to really, how do you say, to really build a plan on how do I get there.
Yeah, but remind me not to ask you to promote our emotional intelligence webinars.
Yes, and it's great. it's great, but the interesting thing is that I believe, and that's a big problem generally, I think, in this, business skills coaching and teaching that we do, is that we have little control over if the effects last.
Right. Yeah, and listen, I've spoken to people from organizational development, L&D teams, people teams over the last 20 years, but in these sessions, and a lot of them will share on these programs, whatever program of development you put in, whether it's 1-day interventions or 10-month programs, unless there is buy-in from, at the very least, the management of the people going through it, let alone C-level sponsorship, I'm not convinced more than 10% remains after 3 months. And that already sounds a lot when I say it.
Yeah, and actually, I think this might be quite close to the truth based on some graph that I saw about this recently. So the question is, I think as humans, we're very capable of absorbing a lot of information and intellectually understanding it. But then there is a big step from understanding that something would make sense to actually changing a behavior. And I think that's where it usually breaks. So you have to be very self-motivated in order to actually take something that you've learned into practice and then also stick with it.
Yeah.
Or, of course, it could also happen. You've learned something, it turns out it wasn't so useful for you. Sometimes that happens because, circumstances and people are different. But in principle, I think the difficulty is inspiring the change in behavior. And with that, if I look at myself, I don't want to point at anyone, so I'm going to just use me. If I look at myself, I have a tendency to, even if I understand that something would make sense, to avoid doing it if for some reason it feels to me unpleasant.
You're not alone there.
I'm not alone. So I'm also completely non-ashamed of admitting it.
Yeah.
So that is a tendency. Now, if I learned something that would require me to do, take on a new behavior, but I'm driven by that, I'd rather avoid in the process of that something that doesn't feel great for me, then I will very easily persuade myself to do that tomorrow. But I'm going to say that every day.
And you and I have talked about motivation before, and motivation is so intrinsically linked to my heart being in it. And if you look at most motivational theory, as human beings, we're driven by 3 critical things. In fact, you could imagine a Venn diagram of these 3 circles together, right? So one reason we do things is to seek out absolute pleasure. The other reason we do things is to avoid pain. And the third reason we do things is purely for efficiency reasons.
Yeah.
And ultimately, behavior only changes once motivation shifts. So the way you were describing before, not just looking at yourself, but sort of from your own development of what your tendencies are, unless you are moved to change, no amount of teaching will make you change. So it's quite interesting, because I think what you're raising here is a really interesting point for me on development, and why perhaps people don't adopt things that they learn on a development program. For example, you and I go on a leadership program, and it's likely that during that leadership program, we will teach people feedback techniques. And there'll be really easy techniques that everyone will be able to use, adopt, and execute with simplicity.
Super
in
example.
the moment they get it, with minutes of hearing the technique.
Yeah, because it's not intellectually challenging.
No, but unless we resolve what goes on inside their heads and hearts before they have to give some critical feedback or have a crucial conversation, no technique is going to help them.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So, for example, I mean, I think this would be a popular example in this scenario, is that people who have a pleaser voice inside of them,
Mhm.
they will find it very difficult to give feedback, because all the time they will frantically try and find a way to ensure that the other person will still like them afterwards.
Right.
Worry about that very much, you know. Just an example, but there might also be other voices in your head that may make you actually decide not to give the feedback as you maybe should. So instead of exploring, but what's the alternative, Brad? How can you get beyond that? What would you say?
Look, I think this is where some of the work that you're doing really comes into play, because it's about recognizing for all development sessions, actually, the job of facilitators, trainers, HR people who are involved in learning is actually we need to go beyond the symptoms. If I'm a people manager and I need to give critical messages to people, but I'm worried about being liked, actually, for me, the thing is, why am I making it an either or? Like, I'm already making it a problem in my head because I'm thinking, oh, I really want to give free feedback to Frank about how he was in that meeting. But the last time I gave Frank feedback, he got really aggressive with me and I didn't like it. So I'd rather not say anything and keep him sweet than say something to him and him get angry with me. So I make it this binary choice. If I say something, you'll get cross with me. If I don't say something, my needs aren't met, but you'll be okay. So things will be all right. So what I'm doing is I'm actually putting your needs in front of mine. And if I don't meet my needs, I'll play out somehow. So I'll get irritated with you. I'll stop trusting you. It will impact the whole relationship. So you said, well, what can we do? I always think of something I learned from Vital Smarts training on crucial conversations.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about CPR. To assess these moments when we, for example, need to give feedback, need to get ahead of ourselves and what our fears are. Use CPR to assess it. Is it a content problem, a pattern problem, or a relationship problem? So if it's a content problem, maybe you and I were at a client call, Frank, and I spoke over you twice. It's quite unusual for me to do that. You're a little bit annoyed, actually, because you thought it was rude and unprofessional. But you're undecided whether you want to give me the feedback because you're not sure. You've never seen me do it before. So maybe you'll just leave it this time. So this is a content issue. Now, knowing you, what you probably do is when we're debriefing after the call, you just say, by the way, Brad, I didn't like it when you spoke over me. I didn't think that came across very professionally. Let's try and not do that.
Yeah.
And I'd have been, oh my God, Frank, yeah, no, I realize. I'm so sorry. I hate doing this stuff on Zoom. Let's give each other signs next. And it would be fine. But actually, other people might think, no, do you know what? I'm not going to say anything. So I don't want to upset it. Frank's more important than me. Or, you know. So then it happens again. And now it's become a pattern.
Yes, exactly.
If I don't say something now, because it's a pattern, a neuropathway that you were describing before is now formed in my head that connects you with that behavior. And now it starts to affect our relationship. So now it's even more difficult for me to give. So we create this non-virtuous cycle by creating these choices. What about if we said, how can I give Frank the feedback and not make him angry? Instead of, if I give Frank the feedback, he will get angry. We've got to change. So this goes to your point right at the beginning of today, right? It's all about mindset. So I assess everything. When somebody does something and I feel it sharpen me up a little bit, content, I can leave it or just say something. Pattern, got to say something. If I don't say something, I've got to accept it's going to impact my relationship, and now communication becomes really challenging. And I think if people assess scenarios in this way, they would be able to step into giving things like feedback or behavioral feedback a little bit more simply.
You know what, and that's a great explanation. I was wondering though, that, you know, even before you teach anybody a great feedback technique, Frank, as the person who is now in your class, I would be listening to you. All the time I feel already, because I know from my normal office life, that I will not enjoy giving anybody a constructive feedback. I mean, I'm great saying to people, "Oh, good job," because that's easy. You know, everybody likes a compliment. Most people actually. But if I am unhappy with something and I would need to give a feedback, I know that something makes me not want to do that. You know. So for me, the thing is the following: if I intellectually understand that I have to give feedback because I don't like the impact of an event that has been triggered by the behavior of another person, if that matters to me, I know intellectually that I need to give feedback somehow to this person without me even knowing yet how, what's the best technique of that. So I see the necessity. However, because I don't stop to think about what am I going to do, I automatically, because in your pattern example, I will default to just letting it drop under the table again, because for me it's convenient. It helps me connect with you know, some of my needs that you mentioned earlier, of, you know, feeling safe and so on. And I think one of the solutions here is to actually teach people to stop and reassess before they decide what they are going to do or you know, are not going to do. In this case, not going to give feedback. So, because if I really understand intellectually that I need to give feedback because I need to avoid future impacts like these, they matter to me, I can try to understand that this feeling that I'm getting about wanting to avoid that comes from me overvaluing to be a pleaser, for example, or to avoid things that are don't feel nice and so on. But this course of action never leads to a good result.
Rarely.
Exactly. But if I become aware of the fact that there's this voice that I'm even externalizing, and I'm giving it a name, and I'm saying, right now I'm sabotaged by my pleaser. You know, he tells me I should be not doing this because maybe the guy isn't liking me afterwards. Then actually that is a lie. It's not helping me achieve what I actually want to achieve, what I need to achieve. So I need to stop and think, okay, okay, so how can I, you know, how can I address the situation? Even asking that question for myself, exploring what are the options here, or asking myself in a year from now, what I would have wished I have done in that, you know, earlier in this year with regards to this person and the feedback and so on. Do I really want to suffer through the whole year and get with, you know, terrible outcomes and lots of negative impact? What would I tell myself if I would be in the future looking back that I do now? You know, as an example, it's just a completely different way of thinking, but it creates positive. Actually creates positive emotions while I address the subject. And if I understand that, and then you tell me, all right, Frank, and the best way of actually delivering constructive feedback is through SBI and, you know, these models of situation, behavior, impact, because it opens the other person up for listening to what you have to say and maybe encourage the behavioral change, then I would be very grateful to use that. But first of all, I kind of need to address that there is a voice in me telling me I'm somehow, I don't know, it's the wrong time, I don't want to hurt anybody, you know, all these kinds of voices that may be in your head. There may be multiple ones.
And what you're doing is you're learning to control the short-term gratification bit, which is what pleases you in that moment, to not confront. But at the same time, it also enables you to challenge your own process because you're learning to respond and not react. So rather than just automatic reaction and going down that highway, actually you respond, you're composed, you're measured, you're reflective. And actually there's so much data, isn't there, about just pausing, taking a breath. What I like about what you're saying is it's that moment of, for me, it's just pushing pause. For anybody who's got, you know, some form of live TV, digital TV connection these days, you know, one of the greatest things is the live pause.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. You can literally, you know, I will stop a game of football, take a call, and then go back and carry on watching it. It's great. And I think it's that moment where you can just pause, step back, something completely different, and come back with a new perspective. And I wonder if actually the way development is going, and I know it does for my workshops, I've noticed it in recent months, giving people that space to talk about what it is for them. And I think we're moving into an age now where actually, because of the way we've had to live this last year, people are more reflective on themselves, what their needs are. Because we've had our needs taken away, all of our desires, the things we really want and need, we can't have them. You know, some people are.
I hope you're right.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping. So I'm positive. I'm optimistic that the reflections people have had this year, whether or not they're able to form positive gratitudinal style approaches, that's not for me to judge. What I would love to think is that people are reflecting on their needs. Like, what do I really need? What do I want? And, you know, to your point, when you've got a manager who's perhaps resistant to giving feedback because they're a people pleaser, what does that person really want? And how does it serve them? And as a coach, I think these are two questions that I find myself often asking.
Mm-hmm.
What do you really want? And how is what you're doing right now serving you?
These are super powerful questions, of course. It forces to stop and reflect.
Right, because there's often a gap between what I'm currently doing and how it's serving this overwhelming purpose that I'm saying is really important to me. Well, if it's that important, do it. Or stop saying it's really important.
It's fascinating how once we, you know, get across, so making this pause and decide deliberately what we want to do, trying to use, you know, some of our you know, mental skills that are more positive, is that the outcomes that we then see from this are actually you know, a lot better than what we were hoping for, you know, so or what we were maybe afraid of what would happen. That also fascinates me a lot. So the amount of catastrophizing over events that have not happened yet and imagining the worst outcomes, I don't know how this became so pervasive in people. I you know, see that a lot, to be honest. People are really catastrophizing. I think more than before, to be honest.
Well, I can't help but wonder, and it's only supposition, but I do wonder whether, with the amount of media and news we've digested over the last 15 months, has created a level of fear that has institutionalized possibly billions of people, where that catastrophizing is.
Yeah, that's about the. Actually, I agree with you with the. I mean, you said I wonder. I think yes, it has. You know, impacted people in this way, and that's for, you know, the big questions that makes. I think it's very easy to speak to our vigilance, you know, our need to survive. Our brain, part of the brain that's responsible for that, is very strong. You know, it will kick in a second and take over very easily for a lot of people. If you do not have the self-command of actually stopping yourself and asking yourself, how do I want to react? You know, so, and I think that's on these big survival questions. But I would go even further and say there's a lot of catastrophizing even on the little day-to-day things.
Well, I think that the overwhelming feeling of fear and catastrophe has now pervaded to the point where people are worrying about the smallest things.
Yeah, yes. And I think I see this connection also. So we've been really, you know, have had our, you know, this part of our brain is so activated. Now it's activated all the time. And we connect everything that happens somehow, you know, or at least, you know, this part of our brain will be always trying to respond to everything, even things that are really, really not worth catastrophizing over.
So in emotional intelligence learning, in neuroscience, the suggestion here is, you know, this is the element of control that we need. The need for, whether it's instant gratification to find a resolution to something, or the need to constantly worry and catastrophize. And actually, this proves a slightly lower level of emotional intelligence across us, because in those moments we can't just stop the flooding, because catastrophizing is flooding. The hormone that's flooding through your body when you catastrophize is cortisol.
Yes.
Right? That's what's raising in your system while you start to really get worried and anxious.
Mm-hmm.
So the technique that they teach through neuroscience is this idea of reality testing. So as soon as you start catastrophizing, again, you can't use the reality test unless you're able to pause.
Yeah.
You've got to catch yourself before you go, because once you go, you're off.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
if you catch yourself diving in, you can reality test. Is this fact or fiction? Is what
Yes.
you're telling yourself, are you making this up? Is this a story you've been told or you're telling yourself? Or is this fact? Because what are the facts? And what's so interesting about all of the examples you gave is, as soon as emotion takes over and we stop using our cognitive thinking brain, because we don't use our emotional brain enough, we don't exercise that part of the muscle enough, when it takes over, it's not always that trustworthy. Whereas my very cognitive thinking, logical brain that likes to look at problem solving, when that kicks into gear, I'm great. So what happens is I get all emotional, I get reactive to something, my thinking brain stops. And now I'm being entrusted to my emotional brain, which could make a long-term decision on a very temporary emotion, and that could be problematic.
True. And it's true. It's really a miracle. I mean, I think biologically, I understand why things are as they are with our brains, and, you know, with our parts of the brain and how they react and what they're for. But you would think that, you know, at this point in our evolution, we should be completely capable of taking command.
Yeah,
But here's the thing. I think as we grow up, somebody should teach us how. And that's not happening.
No, but what's the rule book? Because it's so different for all of us. Because it's about the meaning we put to a situation. So you and I could have both been 6 years old and gone to a sports day. And based on our own experience of that very same sports day, the meaning we would have attached to it would create such a different path for us both to follow. So it's about the meaning. And so it's so hard to create some kind of rule book or playbook that everyone can adopt, because the meaning we give to things is based on so many different elements. It's such a complicated construct how we grow up.
Yeah, but it's not what I was trying to suggest. It's not that I suggest that we all look at things the same way. This would not be possible and even not desirable. But I think what we should learn, and that we should be taught, actually, is this kind of self-command. Is that, you know, we see an event, or we recognize some sort of event, and we stop and ask, how do we want to react? So what are the choices that we have.
Conscious,
Even things that give us pressure emotionally. If I'm triggered by something that gives me some degree of anxiety, I would love that as a kid in school, or I don't know how, I would have already been told to have this self-command to stop and reevaluate with the method of what's true, what's not, or whatever method.
So I love the concept of it, but I think what it needs at school level, perhaps, is an encouragement. You know, we talk about vulnerability and feelings in the corporate world, but actually, to your point, if we did that to our young people, if we encouraged our young children to share what they're feeling without judgment, to express openly their anxiety or their stress, so that we could start teaching those tools when they're very young. By the time they get in their 20s and 30s, dealing with life problems beyond being a teenager, actually they've already got used to how to deal with those they've got the skills, they're well practiced.
Yeah.
I think it would be great. Perhaps we could encourage a world where actually young children are valued for sharing what they're feeling without judgment.
And that's the big part also, the judgment.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, I don't know how we become that, because actually fundamentally I sense so many of us are innately judgmental, whether we
I
want
think we all are, either with ourselves, with others, or with circumstances. We're judging everything. So the question is, to which degree do we allow this? And I think we really need to reserve this for actual I don't know, survival threats, when there's no time to stop and think.
Yeah.
But for everything else, we should be able to pause. But as I said, it's, this also, if you teach adults on trying to explore a different way of doing things, that's actually how we started this conversation. We're saying, and then the pressure comes on and everything's forgotten. This is already hard for an adult, but I think it's hard not because the concept of stopping is so difficult. It's just because you haven't made it as you haven't built a self-command muscle already when you were younger.
Yeah, and you need to have conscious intention to learn something new as you get older, because it's time. You don't notice years of practice when you're 6, but when you're 43, you notice those 3 years every time you're in a difficult situation. You don't remember it when you're younger.
Right.
So yeah, I think that there was a big movement a few years ago here in the UK to start teaching emotional intelligence to young children at school. And
Which is wonderful. I didn't know about that.
But it only in private schools, not on the main curriculum. So it's like an added bonus topic.
Right.
But actually, why don't we start teaching the softer skills of communication? You've been into universities, haven't you, where you've talked to people about the way they communicate, how they come across, how they kind of look for interviews, their branding. When you're looking at that age group, do you see all the same things that we're talking about? So it's consistent. This is a bunch of people who find it hard to maybe just pause and stop. They're very reactive. What do you see?
Extremely difficult for them.
Yeah.
And it's actually incredibly sad. At one point, on the one side, all those young people between 1 year and 25-year-old, they live in the time. Let's not talk about Corona, but generally in the world, where they have so many options of fulfilling their lives in any way they can imagine. And at the same time, they live with so much anxieties around all kinds of things. The degree to which the voices in their head have already taken over their ability to create self-command is significant from what I've seen. And I think it's high time that as a society we actually address that with practical things, such as this has to be a school subject. for people, help people grow up. Maybe in a couple of generations it's no longer needed because all the parents went through it and they're teaching their kids automatically. But as a society, and not only university, I'm not even talking about that, switch on the TV. See when people are interviewed on the streets, how people rally in two different on two different what's the word for that in English again? Camps, excuse me, against each other, triggered about everything immediately. Something's very wrong, and I think it needs to be fixed on a grand scale.
Frank, I think you should run for politics and drive this change. Start in Romania, head out through Eastern Europe into the West, and just change the world, please.
Did I sound like a politician? I may have just sounded like a
politician. Teach our children how to live properly. But you're right. You're passionate.
But I'm passionate about this because it's such a solvable problem.
Right.
Wow.
I think it brings us round, as you said, in a kind of a loop. If you could influence one sort of generation right now with this kind of skill that you're talking about, to stop and pause and just take a moment before choosing an action, who would you focus your attention on? Like, who would you give the skill to if you could just choose one group of sort of a generation?
Well, start young, right?
Yeah.
So, that's probably the biggest effect. But there's actually no real reason to choose. It doesn't have to be. If the intention is there to help address these kinds of personal development skills in people around the world, it would be completely possible.
Yeah. Well, I think Blue Horizon should take this kind of concept right out there. Maybe you could revolutionize how schools are teaching soft skills development.
Yeah, well, I'd love that. I love that.
There's a whole business model to look at there.
Yeah. Who wants to partner with me on this?
Yeah,
later
guys,
you should write your name.
We'll put a little link at the bottom.
Yeah.
Frank at Blue Horizon. Frank, thank you so much for coming on and chatting. I loved it. I like not having a topic with you. I don't know how we got to this point. I can't imagine what the title will be. I'll have to re-listen and land on something.
It was a lot. Thank you very much, Brad.
Brilliant, Frank. See you soon.
Yeah, see you soon. This man has talked about everything.